In this video, we will discuss the passive voice in the perfect tense. You've already worked a little bit with the passive voice, so let's briefly review some of the basics. We'll start with an example of a sentence with a verb in the active voice. We have Pegasus Bellerophontem portat. Pegasus carries Bellerophon. Remember that for an active voice verb, the subject performs the action of the verb. The active voice verb in our example is portat, and the subject, in the nominative case, is Pegasus. Bellerophon is in the accusative case, as a direct object to show that he receives the action of the verb. Here's how we express that same idea in a sentence with a verb in the passive voice. Bellerophon a Pegaso portatur. Bellerophon is carried by Pegasus. Now recall that for a passive voice verb, the subject receives the action of the verb. So our verb in this example is portatur, which uses a passive voice ending. Think about r, ris, tor, mer, mini, and entor. Bellerophon is the nominative subject, and a Pegaso uses the ablative of agent construction to show that Pegasus is performing the action. Now, here is the full chart to show the verb porto partare in the present tense passive voice. We're using the present stem from the second principal part, and the passive voice endings are ris, tor, mer, mini, entor. So these are the forms of the passive voice in the present tense. Now let's turn our attention to the perfect tense. Watch out for how the perfect tense forms the passive voice in a different fashion. Here we have Bellerophon and Pegasus again. This example is Bellerophon a Pegaso portatus est. We translate this as Bellerophon has been carried by Pegasus. You'll notice that our nominative subject, Bellerophon, is receiving the action of a passive voice verb. A Pegaso uses the ablative of agent construction to show that Pegasus performed the action. And portatus est is our main verb in the passive voice and the perfect tense. You probably recognize est as the third person singular of sum esse in the present tense. Our verb here is likewise in the third person singular. You can also recognize the us masculine ending on the form portatus, which reflects the gender of the subject, Bellerophon. Let's look at another example of the perfect tense passive voice. Always ab Hercule interfecti sunt. The birds have been killed by Hercules. The nominative subject, always, birds, receives the action, and the action is performed by Hercules, who is our ablative of agent. The main verb, interfecti sunt, is in the perfect tense and passive voice. Notice that the verb includes sunt, which shows us that the verb is third person plural. The form interfecti uses the ae feminine plural ending, since our subject always is also feminine plural. Now let's consolidate what we've seen so far about the passive voice in the perfect tense. The verb comprises a two-word phrase. One of those words will be a form of the verb to be in the present tense. Think sum esse est, sumus estis sunt. The other word will be a perfect participle. We'll learn more about participles in a separate lesson, but for now, just know that the participle is an adjective formed from the fourth principal part. More on this in a moment. The translation formula for these verbs is has been blanked. Now, there is some degree of flexibility here, and we'll get to that flexibility at the end of this video. Let's glance back at our two verbs from before, portatus est and interfecti sunt. Notice the participle in both examples, portatus and interfecti. Notice also the form of the verb to be, est and sunt. Both translations use the formula has been blanked. Now, let's talk about participles and principal parts for a moment. You know that every principal part has a specific purpose for verb formations. For the perfect passive, we will need to use the fourth principal part. This is what gives us the perfect passive participle, and we've already seen a couple examples of this. Now, remember that the perfect participle is an adjective, and specifically a first and second declension adjective. So from our first example verb here, we'll take amatum and give it the endings us, and we have amatus, amata, amatum. From our second example verb on this slide, we'll take factum and give it the same adjective endings, us, and we have factus, facta, factum. Let's do a full chart for this, and use porto portare as an example. We'll start with that fourth pencil part, and write it in all the positions on the chart. Let's make this a masculine participle by using the us endings, portatus. But this isn't quite right. The plural forms will have to change, because us is only a masculine singular ending. So here it is, portatus in the singular and portati in the plural. We can easily make our participle feminine, portata in the singular and portatai in the plural. Or even neuter, portatum in the singular and portata in the plural. But let's go back to masculine for the time being. We know that we need the verb to be in the present tense. So we'll add sum in the first person singular. And then add the remaining present forms. Portatus sum, portatus es, portatus est, portati sumus, portati estis, portati sunt. We can translate this chart using the has been blanked formula. I'll draw your attention to the third person singular. Now, normally we give the options he, she, or it for the third person singular translation. But since we're using a masculine participle here, Latin tells us definitively that our subject is masculine. So we translate, he has been carried. And like just a moment ago, we can change these forms to talk about a feminine subject using the feminine participle, portata and portatai. Or even about a neuter subject, portatum and portata. Let's try another brief example, duco, ducere. Write out the fourth pencil part and change it to a masculine participle. And remember to use the nominative plural ending for the plural column. Ductus is our singular, and ducti is the plural. Now we add the verb to be from the present tense. Ductus sum, ductus es, ductus est, ducti sumus, ducti estis, ducti sunt. And we translate this with the has been blanked formula. Notice that the third person singular, again, uses that pronoun he. Let's change this to show the feminine forms. We just change the participle to ducta in the singular and ducti in the plural. Notice that our subject of the verb is now feminine with the pronoun she. And let's look at the neuter forms, ductum in the singular and ducta in the plural. Notice that the subject is neuter and uses the pronoun it. Now, two quick sentences for translation. Hoc carmen ab amicis auditum est. The verb is auditum est. And we can tell our subject is neuter from the participle's um ending. The nominative subject is hoc carmen. And ab amicis is our ablative of agent. So we translate, the song has been heard by the friends. Since our verb is in the passive voice, the subject is receiving the action. I mentioned before that there's some flexibility in the translation formula here, and here it is. We can also treat the perfect tense as a simple past tense. And here we translate the sentence as, this song was heard by the friends.